At 1:55 a.m., the security camera catches Brian Shaffer stepping toward the escalator landing outside a crowded bar. He pauses. He turns slightly. Then he disappears from view. He is never seen again. Brian Shaffer didn't vanish in the woods. He didn't disappear on a remote highway or during a storm. He vanished inside one of the busiest nightlife districts in Columbus, Ohio, surrounded by people, lights, and cameras. And according to investigators, there was only one way in and one way out. On the night of March 31st, 2006, Brian Shaffer was a 27-year-old medical student just weeks away from graduating from the Ohio State University College of Medicine. Friends described him as intelligent, social, and deeply private when it came to stress. He was grieving the recent loss of his mother, Renee, who had died of cancer only weeks earlier. Despite that weight, Brian agreed to go out with friends, to unwind, to feel normal, if only for a few hours. That decision would place him at the center of one of the most baffling disappearances in modern American history. Brian was raised in Pickerington, Ohio. By all outward measures, his life was on a clear trajectory. Medical school, a committed girlfriend, and a future planned down to the month. But behind the scenes, the last year of his life had been turbulent. His mother's illness had taken a visible toll. Friends later recalled that Brian compartmentalized grief, rarely speaking about it, choosing instead to distract himself with work and social outings. His relationship with his long-term girlfriend, Alexis Wolfe, was strained. They had discussed the future, but cracks had begun to show. None of this suggested Brian was about to disappear, but it did paint a picture of someone under quiet pressure. The Ugly Tuna Saloon wasn't just a bar. It sat on the second floor of a complex known as South Campus Gateway, directly across from Ohio State. To reach it, patrons had to take an escalator up from the street-level entrance. At the top, the bar opened into a packed, dimly lit space. Music loud, bodies close, drinks flowing. Security cameras covered the escalator area. According to police, anyone entering or exiting the bar had to pass those cameras. That fact would later become the cornerstone of the mystery. On March 31st, Brian met his friend Clint Florence at a nearby bar. Later, they joined Brian's friend Meredith Panzenbeck and her boyfriend Trevor Shermer at the Ugly Tuna. Witnesses remember nothing unusual at first. Brian appeared relaxed. He laughed, he talked, he flirted casually with two women near closing time. At approximately 1:55 a.m., Brian stepped outside the bar area, reportedly to say goodbye to the women. That moment, mundane, forgettable, would become the last confirmed sighting of Brian Shaffer. Security footage shows Brian walking toward the escalator landing outside the bar. Then, nothing. No footage of him descending the escalator. No footage of him exiting the building. No footage of him re-entering the bar. Police would later state that no one matching Brian's description was seen leaving through the main exit after that time. Which leads to the question that still haunts investigators. How does a man vanish from a building with cameras without being captured on any of them? At closing time, Brian's friends waited for him. Minutes passed, then an hour. Calls went unanswered. Initially, they assumed Brian had gone home with someone or slipped away quietly. It wasn't until the next morning, When he missed important plans, that concern set in. By April 1st, Brian Shaffer was officially reported missing. Columbus police quickly focused on the ugly tuna saloona. They reviewed hours of footage. They interviewed staff. They searched the surrounding construction zones. Nothing. No evidence of a struggle. No signs of injury. No trace of Brian outside the bar. The absence itself became the evidence. When investigators publicly stated that Brian Shaffer never exited the ugly tuna saloona, it transformed a missing person case into a paradox. Because the cameras didn't just miss him, they missed everyone like him. According to police, no footage showed Brian descending the escalator after 1:55 a.m., and no footage showed a man matching his description leaving the building through the main entrance. That conclusion rests on one assumption, that the escalator was the only viable exit. At the time of Brian's disappearance, the South Campus Gateway complex was still partially under construction. Behind the bar, service corridors and unfinished areas existed, spaces not intended for public use, but accessible to staff. One prevailing theory suggests Brian may have wandered into one of these restricted zones, not to escape, not to hide, but by accident. Supporters of this theory point to unsecured doors and minimal signage. Critics counter that staff would have noticed an unfamiliar face, especially in a crowded closing hour. Extensive searches of these areas turned up nothing. No clothing, no blood, no personal items. That night, a band was performing at the Ugly Tuna. Early in the investigation, rumors circulated online suggesting the musicians may have assisted Brian in leaving unnoticed. Police investigated. They interviewed band members. They reviewed footage. No evidence supported the claim. The band members were cleared. But the rumor persisted, not because it was strong, but because nothing else made sense. Two women spoke with Brian shortly before he vanished. They described the interaction as casual, forgettable. Brian stepped away to talk with them. He smiled, he joked. Then he excused himself. They did not see him leave. They did not see him return. They did not see him again. Months after Brian disappeared, his phone rang. The call went to voicemail. The origin traced to a cell tower in Hilliard, Ohio, miles from the Ugly Tuna. When Brian's girlfriend listened to the message, there was no voice, only background noise. Indistinct, unidentifiable. Police believe the call may have been a misdial, or a delayed signal, or interference. But to Brian's family, it sounded like something else. Like movement, like life. Brian's father, Randy Shaffer, refused to let the case go quiet. He organized searches. He distributed flyers. He pressed investigators for answers. Years passed. Then tragedy struck again. In 2008, Randy Shaffer died suddenly. Brian's case went from unresolved to orphaned. Columbus police maintain that Brian likely exited the building unseen, a momentary obstruction, a camera blind spot. They argue that no evidence suggests foul play inside the bar. But critics argue something else. If he did leave, why has there never been a confirmed sighting? No bank activity, no social security usage, no credible trace. More than a decade after Brian Shaffer vanished, the case remains suspended in uncertainty. No evidence has emerged strong enough to close the file. Only theories, each plausible at first glance, each collapsing under closer inspection. Some investigators have quietly suggested that Brian may have chosen to disappear. Supporters of this theory point to his emotional state, the death of his mother, the pressure of medical school, strain in his relationship. But the theory falters quickly. Brian left behind his passport, his credit cards, his bank accounts. He made no preparations, no withdrawals, no goodbye messages. Vanishing deliberately requires planning. Brian left none. Another explanation suggests an accidental death. That Brian wandered into a restricted area, fell, became trapped. But repeated searches, initially and years later, found nothing. No remains, no personal effects. In a building surrounded by students, workers, and security, an unnoticed fatal accident strains belief. The most unsettling possibility is foul play. That Brian encountered the wrong person at the wrong time. But there is no sign of a struggle. No witnesses. No evidence recovered from the bar or surrounding area. If foul play occurred, it left no trace and required extraordinary precision. Police continue to stand by the idea that Brian left the building unseen. A camera glitch, a brief obstruction. If that is true, then the mystery moves beyond the ugly tuna. Because if Brian walked out into Columbus that night, he vanished into a city that has never seen him again. Brian Shaffer's disappearance endures not because of what is known, but because of what is missing. A final image, a confirmed exit, a body. Instead, there is a pause in time. A man steps out of frame, and reality fails to follow. Some mysteries grow smaller with time. This one grows larger. Because every year that passes without an answer reinforces the same question: how does someone vanish in plain sight? Brian Shaffer walked into a bar surrounded by people and walked out of history.